They revoked her badge without explanation. No hearing, no appeal, just a suspension order that appeared overnight in the security system. Colonel Rachel Vance stood outside Fort Bragg's main gate at 6:15 a.m., holding a cardboard box with 22 years of service inside, watching younger soldiers pass through barriers she could no longer cross. But what none of them knew was that approximately 105 minutes earlier, someone at the Pentagon had discovered the suspension order was fraudulent. And right now, 3 generals were trying to figure out how to fix a mistake that could cost American lives. Rachel Vance had woken at 4:45 a.m. that Tuesday morning, the same time she'd woken for 4 years. Shower, uniform, coffee in a travel mug, out the door by 5:30 a.m. The drive from her off-base apartment to Fort Bragg took 25 minutes in pre-dawn darkness. She listened to intelligence briefing podcasts during the commute, staying current on global threat assessments. The familiar routine had become more than habit. It was discipline earned through 2 decades of military service, deployed to Afghanistan twice, Iraq once, and Pakistan for an 18-month intelligence coordination assignment. At 6 a.m. exactly, Rachel pulled up to Fort Bragg's main gate. She'd timed this arrival for 4 years, knowing that 6 a.m. meant lighter traffic at the checkpoint. Today's briefing was critical. She'd spent 3 weeks identifying a pattern in terrorist communications that suggested something big was coming. 3 separate networks across different countries, normally competitors, showing coordination that didn't make operational sense unless someone was orchestrating them. A young private was manning the gate. Rachel recognized him as one of the newer guards, maybe 2 months on duty. He had the eager professionalism of someone still following every procedure by the book. Rachel handed over her military ID and security badge, expecting the usual quick scan and wave through. The guard swiped her ID through the reader. His expression changed. The screen showed something that made his eyes widen, then narrow in confusion. He looked at Rachel, then back at his screen, then reached for his phone. Rachel felt the first hint of unease. The guard spoke quietly into his phone, listened, then set it down. His face had gone from confused to uncomfortable. He asked Rachel to pull her vehicle to the side holding area. The duty officer was coming. Her credentials showed as suspended. He didn't have details, just orders to hold her until the duty officer arrived. Suspended. The word hit Rachel like cold water. She'd had top-secret/sensitive compartmented information clearance for 18 years. She was the senior intelligence analyst for an entire geographic combatant command. Her work directly supported teams in the field. Suspension wasn't something that happened by accident. Rachel pulled her car to the designated holding area and waited. Through her windshield, she could see the normal flow of morning traffic entering the base. Soldiers in uniform, civilian contractors with ID badges, delivery trucks being inspected. The ordinary rhythm of a military installation beginning its day. None of them knew that something had just gone very wrong. At 6:07 a.m., a staff car pulled up. Colonel Marcus Webb stepped out. Rachel knew Webb by reputation. Deputy Base Commander for Security, career officer who'd spent the last decade in administrative roles. He approached with the expression of someone about to deliver bad news that wasn't his fault. Rachel got out of her car. Webb didn't salute, which told her everything. She was no longer being treated as a fellow officer, but as a security problem. Webb handed Rachel a printed form without preamble. Her security clearance had been suspended effective 4 a.m. that morning. Badge and access cards required immediately. The grounds? Unreported foreign contacts during her Pakistan deployment 3 years ago. The accusation was absurd. 3 years ago, Rachel had been deployed to Pakistan as part of a joint intelligence task force tracking Taliban networks along the Afghan border. Every meeting with Pakistani intelligence officers, every contact with local sources, Every debriefing session had been documented according to protocol. She'd filed contact reports within 24 hours of every meeting. Her work had been reviewed and approved by 2 levels of command. Rachel started to explain that all her foreign contacts were properly reported. Webb cut her off. That was part of the investigation. Until resolved, she was suspended from all classified access. Badge and cards now. Rachel slowly unclipped her security badge from her uniform. 22 years of service reduced to plastic cards in Webb's hand. 2 military police officers appeared to escort her to collect personal items. 15 minutes to pack. Her files stayed, her computer locked, years of intelligence work suddenly inaccessible. The briefing at 7 a.m. would be presented by Captain Martinez, someone who didn't understand the full scope of the analysis Rachel had been developing. Martinez was competent, but he'd only been read into Rachel's current project 3 days ago. He knew pieces, but not the complete picture. The intelligence Rachel had developed required understanding 3 separate intelligence streams that normally didn't intersect. At 6:12 a.m., Rachel walked out of Fort Bragg's main gate carrying a cardboard box. She sat in her car trying to call her supervisor, her deputy, her team leader. Every call went to voicemail. Her entire professional network had gone silent. Rachel drove to a gas station 2 miles from the base and pulled into the parking lot. She needed to think. This wasn't random. The timing was too precise. She'd been scheduled to brief a joint task force at 7 a.m. on intelligence that could prevent a major terrorist attack. Someone had suspended her clearance at 4 a.m., ensuring she couldn't access the classified systems needed for the briefing. The question was, who had the access and motivation to create a fake suspension order? Because Rachel was now certain that's what this was. The accusation about unreported Pakistan contacts was fabricated. Someone had inserted false information into the personnel security system specifically to neutralize her before that briefing. At 6:18 a.m., Rachel's phone rang. Unknown number, 202 area code, Washington, D.C. The voice identified herself as Colonel Sarah Mitchell from the Defense Intelligence Agency. Rachel's suspension order was fraudulent, inserted into security systems using stolen credentials. DIA had discovered it at 4:30 a.m. during routine overnight audits. None of the required authorization signatures existed. The investigation mentioned in the suspension order didn't exist. Someone with sophisticated access had wanted Rachel away from her work. Rachel's mind immediately went to the briefing. She'd identified coordination between 3 terrorist networks planning simultaneous attacks on U.S. bases in the Middle East. The pattern suggested state-level support, sophisticated planning, target date within 72 hours. Mitchell's voice became urgent. The fake suspension wasn't random. Someone knew Rachel was close to exposing something critical. The timing suggested they wanted to prevent that 7 a.m. briefing. DIA was coordinating with Fort Bragg Command to reverse the suspension, but bureaucracy moved slowly, even in emergencies. Rachel looked at her watch. 6:22 a.m. The briefing started in 38 minutes. Even if they reversed her suspension immediately, she'd never make it through security processing in time. Mitchell said a courier was already en route from the Pentagon with emergency credentials. Standard procedure for fixing catastrophic security system failures. But that was a 90-minute drive minimum. The briefing would be over before the courier arrived. Rachel pulled out her laptop, connecting to her personal encrypted cloud storage where she'd backed up portions of her analysis. Not the classified source material, but her analytical framework showing how 3 separate networks were coordinating. She started drafting an executive summary that could be transmitted through unclassified channels if necessary, stripped of sources and methods, but preserving the core threat assessment, At 6:31 a.m., before she could finish, her phone rang again. Different number, still 202 area code. This time the voice belonged to General Patricia Caldwell, Deputy Director of Defense Intelligence Agency. The situation had escalated beyond a simple security system error. DIA's cybersecurity team had traced the fraudulent suspension order through multiple proxy servers. The sophistication suggested foreign intelligence service involvement. Someone had specifically targeted Rachel because her analysis was about to expose something they desperately wanted hidden. General Caldwell had already briefed the Secretary of Defense. Emergency protocols were being activated, but they had a more immediate problem. The Joint Task Force briefing at 7 a.m. needed Rachel's full analysis, not the condensed version Captain Martinez would present. Caldwell's solution was direct. Fort Bragg's airfield had a UH-60 Black Hawk on routine standby. Caldwell was issuing orders to divert it for emergency personnel recovery. The helicopter would pick up Rachel from her current location and fly her directly to Fort Bragg's parade field, bypassing gate security entirely. She'd arrive with emergency credentials signed by the Secretary of Defense's office. The plan violated several protocols, but Caldwell had the authority when American lives were at stake. Rachel gave her exact GPS coordinates. Caldwell said the helicopter crew was receiving orders right now. Flight time from Fort Bragg's airfield, approximately 8 minutes. At 6:51 a.m., Rachel heard the distinctive sound of UH-60 rotors. The Black Hawk came in low over the tree line, descended rapidly toward an empty field adjacent to the gas station. Other cars were pulling over, people getting out with phones to record what they probably thought was some kind of emergency. The helicopter touched down in the empty field, rotors still spinning at flight idle. The crew chief waved Rachel forward. She grabbed her laptop and ran toward the aircraft. The crew chief pulled her aboard and handed her a manila envelope. The Black Hawk lifted off immediately, climbing and banking toward Fort Bragg. Through the window, Rachel could see cars stopped on the road nearby, people pointing at the departing helicopter. She opened the envelope. Emergency credentials with her photo, security badge with temporary access codes, and a letter on Department of Defense letterhead. Colonel Rachel Vance's security clearance was immediately and fully restored. Any previous suspension orders were void. Signed by the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Rachel took a deep breath and looked at her watch. 8 minutes until she'd be on the ground at Fort Bragg. 8 minutes until everything would change. The helicopter touched down on Fort Bragg's main parade field at 6:59 a.m. Exactly 8 minutes flight time, just as General Caldwell had predicted. A staff car was waiting with Major Stevens, Rachel's supervisor, holding another folder. His expression mixed relief and frustration. Stevens handed Rachel additional authorization documents as she reached the car. Webb was there too, looking considerably less confident than he had 45 minutes earlier when revoking her access. He apologized, explaining he'd simply followed what the security system showed without questioning the underlying authorization chain. Rachel was in the conference room at 7:01 a.m. The Joint Task Force representatives were already seated. CIA, NSA, JSOC, Defense Intelligence Agency, and Fort Bragg's senior command staff. People who made decisions about deploying military assets and authorizing operations. Captain Martinez was at the podium with a laptop ready to begin, his opening slide displayed on the screen. He looked up when Rachel entered, relief washing over his face. General Foster, Fort Bragg's commanding general, stood up. The confusion about Rachel's status had been resolved. With Foster's permission, Rachel took over the briefing. Rachel connected her laptop to the projection system and pulled up her full analysis. She began speaking. 3 terrorist networks across different countries showing coordinated activity. Individual networks had been monitored by various intelligence agencies for years. CIA had one network, NSA had another, JSOC was tracking the third. But nobody had noticed they were starting to coordinate. Rachel was the first analyst to have access to all 3 intelligence streams simultaneously. Her assignment was to look for patterns across geographic regions, to identify threats that individual agencies might miss. And she'd found something. The communication timing was too precise to be coincidental. Messages were being passed between the networks using intermediaries and cutouts, but when you mapped the timing, you could see the orchestration. Someone was coordinating all 3 groups toward a common objective. The pattern analysis suggested Moscow's involvement. The encryption methods, the routing protocols, the operational security measures all matched techniques GRU had used in previous operations. Russia wasn't directing the attacks directly, but providing coordination services, communications infrastructure, and probably intelligence about U.S. base security protocols. The target analysis showed initial strikes at 3 U.S. military facilities. Bases in Qatar, Kuwait, and Djibouti would be hit simultaneously during morning shift changes when security was briefly degraded. Car bombs at main gates, possibly followed by small arms attacks. But those weren't the primary objective. Those were diversions. While American forces responded to 3 simultaneous attacks, the real strike would hit the Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid Air Base. That facility controlled all air operations across the region. Destroy it, and deployed units would lose air support, intelligence coordination, and extraction capability. The room was completely silent. Rachel could see the CIA representative typing on a secure tablet, probably checking his agency's intelligence on the networks she'd mentioned. The NSA analyst was reviewing something on her screen, likely signals intelligence that correlated with Rachel's analysis. Foster asked about timeline. Rachel pulled up her analysis. Attack window opened in approximately 54 hours based on communication patterns. Most likely execution during morning shift change at all 4 facilities, between 7 a.m. and 8 a.m. local time. The CIA representative asked about confidence levels. Rachel provided specific percentages: 85% on target locations, 90% on foreign coordination, 75% on specific timing. The JSOC officer leaned forward. Moscow was coordinating a terrorist attack that would isolate U.S. operators in the field? Rachel clarified. Not coordinating directly, providing the infrastructure and intelligence that made coordination possible. Russia got plausible deniability because they weren't planting the bombs, but they were providing the capability that turned 3 separate operations into a coordinated strike. Foster asked why. Rachel explained the strategic logic. If this succeeded, Moscow demonstrated they could disrupt U.S. military operations without directly engaging American forces. They showed potential adversaries how to neutralize U.S. air superiority, and they created a model for future operations where they provided coordination infrastructure while others took the risk. The NSA analyst spoke up. She'd been monitoring one of the networks for 8 months and wasn't seeing the coordination pattern Rachel described. Rachel pulled up a new slide showing communications from all 3 networks overlaid on the same timeline. When you looked at one network in isolation, the coordination wasn't visible. But when you mapped all 3 together and looked at timing rather than content, the pattern became clear. Their activity cycles were synchronized in ways that weren't natural. The analyst studied the slide. Her expression changed from skeptical to concerned. Foster concluded the briefing. Representatives from each agency had 30 minutes to brief their leadership and return with response recommendations. Rachel was to remain available for follow-up questions. The room emptied rapidly. Within minutes, Rachel's intelligence assessment was being briefed to the CIA director, NSA director, JSOC commander, and the Secretary of Defense. The response came together with remarkable speed. Enhanced security measures were implemented at all 4 potential target locations. Teams in the field were repositioned for mutual support. Intelligence collection intensified on the 3 terrorist networks. Counterintelligence investigation launched to identify who had created the fake suspension order. By the following morning, foreign intelligence officers in 3 countries were receiving urgent messages from their terrorist contacts. Operations were being called off. Too much American security presence, too much indication that communications had been compromised. The carefully orchestrated attack was abandoned before the first bomb was planted. Operators continued their missions unaware of how close they'd come to losing air support. Soldiers at 4 bases went about their duties never knowing that coordinated attacks had been planned and prevented. The intelligence success remained highly classified. But Rachel's work wasn't finished. Someone had tried to silence her intelligence assessment. That person was still out there with access to military personnel systems. And that threat needed to be eliminated. Rachel spent the next 2 weeks working with DIA's cybersecurity team to trace the fraudulent suspension order. The digital forensics were complex, professional work that routed through proxy servers in Eastern Europe. But the person who created the order had made one mistake. The suspension referenced specific details about Rachel's Pakistan deployment that weren't in any standard database. Details that only someone who'd read her classified trip reports would know. Rachel pulled the access logs for her Pakistan deployment files. Only 23 people had viewed them in the past 3 years. She cross-referenced that list against personnel with technical skills to hack military systems. The list narrowed to 7 names. Then she looked at duty schedules for the night the suspension order was created. Only 3 of those 7 had been working late that night. And one name stood out. Thomas Kellerman, civilian contractor in Fort Bragg's IT security division, former NSA analyst who'd left the agency 2 years ago. Hired by Fort Bragg specifically because he understood how NSA's monitoring worked. Kellerman had the access, the knowledge, and the opportunity. Now Rachel just needed to prove it. She coordinated with FBI counterintelligence to place Kellerman under surveillance. Over the next 72 hours, agents monitored his movements, his communications, and his online activity. On the 3rd night, at 2:47 a.m., they intercepted an encrypted message from Kellerman's computer to a known foreign intelligence officer. Kellerman was reporting that the analyst who'd identified the coordination had been successfully neutralized. He was asking when his next payment would arrive. At 3:20 a.m. on a Thursday morning, FBI agents surrounded Kellerman's apartment. They'd been watching him for 72 hours, waiting for the perfect moment. When they breached the door, Kellerman was at his computer, mid-message to his handler. The screen showed encrypted text congratulating the handler on successfully removing the problematic analyst. His finger was still on the keyboard when handcuffs clicked around his wrists. His apartment contained encrypted communications with foreign intelligence going back 18 months. Detailed files about Rachel's work, including copies of reports he shouldn't have been able to access. Banking records showing deposits totaling over $340,000 from offshore accounts linked to Moscow's intelligence services. During FBI interrogation, Kellerman described his recruitment with detached calm. He'd been approached through an online forum 3 years ago, offered money for minor information about Fort Bragg's network security. The requests gradually escalated. More money for more sensitive information. Eventually, he was too compromised to refuse, even when requests became dangerous. When his handler learned that Rachel's analysis was about to expose their coordination of terrorist networks, they'd ordered Kellerman to neutralize her investigation before she could brief decision-makers. Creating a fake suspension order seemed like an elegant solution. Remove her access, discredit her with security concerns, ensure her intelligence never reached people who could act on it. What Kellerman hadn't anticipated was DIA's audit systems catching the fraudulent order within hours, or General Caldwell's willingness to authorize a helicopter pickup to bypass normal security procedures, or Rachel's determination to complete her mission regardless of obstacles. His attempt to silence critical intelligence had instead focused attention on exactly what he was trying to hide. Moscow lost a valuable asset inside a major U.S. military installation. The terrorist networks lost their coordination support and abandoned their planned attacks. And Rachel's intelligence work, which might have been dismissed or delayed under normal circumstances, received immediate action at the highest levels. Kellerman was convicted of espionage in federal court 8 months later. 30 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. His case became a training example at every military cybersecurity course and counterintelligence briefing. A reminder that insider threats could come from contractors with legitimate access and trusted positions. Fort Bragg's IT security division was completely restructured after Kellerman's arrest. New oversight protocols required two-person integrity on all system administration tasks. Enhanced monitoring looked for unusual access patterns or unauthorized changes to personnel records. Regular audits checked for the kind of manipulation Kellerman had performed. Colonel Webb, who'd revoked Rachel's access based on the fake suspension order, personally briefed every security officer on base about the importance of verifying orders that came through unusual channels. He kept a printout of the fraudulent suspension order on his office wall as a reminder that computers could be manipulated and that common sense needed to accompany protocol. General Caldwell sent Rachel a brief email 3 weeks after Kellerman's arrest. Subject line simply read, "Well done." The message body contained 2 sentences. "Good work on the threat analysis. Even better work on not letting a fake suspension stop you from completing your mission." 6 months after the incident, Rachel was promoted to full colonel and transferred to Defense Intelligence Agency headquarters in Washington, D.C. Her new assignment focused on identifying sophisticated threats that crossed traditional agency boundaries. Exactly the kind of pattern analysis that had identified the coordinated terrorist networks. On her first day at DIA headquarters, Rachel was given an office with a view of the Pentagon. The space was larger than her Fort Bragg workspace, with better computer systems and direct access to intelligence streams from multiple agencies. But what struck her most was the manila envelope sitting on her desk. Inside was a photograph taken by someone at the gas station parking lot that morning. It showed the UH-60 Black Hawk landing, Rachel running toward it with her laptop bag, the crew chief reaching out to pull her aboard. Someone had printed the image and written across the bottom, "When the system fails, people still have to make it right." General Caldwell had left it as a reminder, a symbol of what had happened that morning when bureaucracy had been bypassed, when protocols had been violated, when a 3-star general had authorized a helicopter to pick up a suspended analyst from a parking lot because lives mattered more than procedures. Rachel kept that photograph on her desk at DIA headquarters. It reminded her of several important lessons she'd learned that morning. Systems could be manipulated. Computers could be hacked. Procedures could be twisted by sophisticated adversaries who understood how to exploit bureaucratic processes. The fraudulent suspension order had been convincing enough to fool base security, detailed enough to appear legitimate, and timed perfectly to prevent her from completing her mission. But systems were created and maintained by people. And when those systems failed, people still had the ability to recognize the failure and take action to fix it. Colonel Mitchell had caught the fraudulent order during a routine audit. General Caldwell had cut through bureaucracy to get Rachel to that briefing. The Joint Task Force had acted on her intelligence despite the confusion about her status. The helicopter ride had been 8 minutes. But in those 8 minutes, Rachel had gone from suspended analyst sitting in a gas station parking lot to briefing senior decision-makers on a terrorist threat that would have killed American soldiers and disrupted military operations across an entire region. 8 minutes that made the difference between a successful terrorist attack and a preventive intelligence victory. 8 minutes that happened because people refused to accept that a computer system's judgment was final. Rachel thought about that often during her work at DIA headquarters. She was responsible for identifying threats that crossed organizational boundaries, for connecting intelligence streams that individual agencies didn't share, for seeing patterns that others missed because they were looking at pieces rather than the whole picture. It was the same kind of work she'd been doing at Fort Bragg when someone had tried to silence her. The same analytical approach that had identified foreign coordination of terrorist networks. The same persistence in following patterns, even when the connections weren't immediately obvious. But now she worked in an environment with better security, more robust audit systems, and colleagues who understood that the most dangerous threats often came from sophisticated adversaries who knew how to manipulate the systems designed to protect against them. A year after the incident, Rachel was invited to speak at a conference on counterintelligence and insider threats. She told the story of that morning at Fort Bragg, walking the audience through how a fraudulent suspension order had been created, how it had been detected, and how the response had prevented both a terrorist attack and allowed the identification of a foreign intelligence asset. During the question and answer session, someone asked what she'd learned from the experience. Rachel thought for a moment before answering. The most important lesson was about the relationship between systems and people. Systems were necessary. Protocols existed for good reasons. Security procedures protected classified information and ensured that only authorized personnel had access to sensitive material. But systems were tools created by people to serve specific purposes. When those systems were compromised or failed, it was people who had to recognize the failure and take action. The second lesson was about the importance of persistence. Rachel had been kicked off Fort Bragg, stripped of her credentials, told her intelligence assessment would be handled by someone else. It would have been easy to accept that judgment, to wait for the investigation to clear her name, to let the bureaucratic process work at its own pace. Instead, she'd continued working on her laptop in a parking lot, preparing to transmit her analysis through whatever channels remained available. That persistence had made her ready when General Caldwell called with an emergency solution. The third lesson was about trust. When Colonel Mitchell called that morning to explain the suspension order was fraudulent, Rachel could have been skeptical. When General Caldwell proposed using a helicopter to bypass security, Rachel could have questioned whether the plan was legitimate. But she'd trusted that people at DIA were working to fix a problem, and that trust had been validated by their actions. The audience was silent when Rachel finished speaking. Then someone started clapping, and the applause spread through the room. These were intelligence professionals, counterintelligence officers, security specialists. They understood exactly how serious the threat had been and how close the system had come to allowing that threat to succeed. After the conference, several people approached Rachel with their own stories. An analyst whose clearance had been suspended due to a computer error, creating weeks of disruption before the mistake was discovered. A security officer who'd caught fraudulent orders in his system and traced them back to a foreign intelligence operation. A military officer who'd had to choose between following procedures and doing what the situation required, knowing that either choice carried risks. Each story reinforced what Rachel had learned. The defense of the United States didn't happen just on battlefields or in diplomatic negotiations. It happened every day in the quiet work of intelligence analysts identifying threats, security officers protecting systems, and decision-makers willing to act when the moment required it. And sometimes it happened in gas station parking lots where helicopters landed to pick up analysts who'd been wrongly suspended because their work threatened an adversary's operation. Rachel continued working at DIA headquarters for the next 3 years, leading a team of analysts focused on identifying sophisticated threats from state actors and terrorist networks. Her team prevented 2 more coordinated attacks, identified 3 insider threats before they could cause serious damage, and developed new analytical methods that were adopted across the intelligence community. She never forgot the lessons from that morning at Fort Bragg. The cardboard box she'd packed in 15 minutes under MP supervision sat in her office closet, a reminder of how quickly things could change. The manila envelope with emergency credentials that had been delivered by helicopter crew stayed in her desk drawer, a symbol of how creative solutions could overcome bureaucratic obstacles. But the most important reminder was the photograph from the parking lot. The image of the helicopter landing, the moment when everything changed, the 8 minutes that made the difference between failure and success. Because that's what intelligence work was really about. Not the classified databases, or the sophisticated analytical tools, or the secure facilities. It was about people who refused to quit when systems failed, who found ways to complete their mission despite obstacles, who believed their work mattered enough to fight through bureaucracy and uncertainty. Rachel had been one of those people that morning. And now, in her position at DIA headquarters, she worked to ensure that other analysts would have the support they needed when they found themselves in similar situations. Better audit systems to catch fraudulent orders faster, clearer protocols for emergency credential restoration, direct communication channels between working-level analysts and senior decision-makers who could authorize creative solutions when standard procedures weren't sufficient. The system had failed Rachel that morning at Fort Bragg. But people had made it right. And she'd spent the rest of her career working to make the system itself more resilient, more responsive, more capable of supporting the people who did the critical work of protecting the nation.